everything on this plane is run by computers. So to say that you can only fly this plane from the cockpit is not strictly true. However, the authorities who are looking for this plane have set the probability in their kind of Bayesian inferential logic. They have set the probability that somebody took over this plane from the electronics bay to 0. So in Bayesian thinking, which is how the scientific method basically works, is that you're constantly updating your priors. Like you basically have a model of how this thing is set up, and as new information comes in, you modify your model. But if you set one of your assumptions to 0%, there's no new incoming information is going to alter. Zero times anything is still 0. And so lately in my podcast, I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are experts in aviation cybersecurity and ask them, is it impossible to take this plane from the electronics bay? And the answer is, it's not impossible. Now, people have different assessments as to how plausible it is.
Right.
But the fact is, that probability is not 0.
That's really, I guess, why do they say it is impossible, or they've taken it down to 0? What is the justification? That's Malaysian government?
I think it's kind of like, imagine that you want to send your kids to college and your spouse's plan is to buy a lottery ticket, right? And the lottery ticket, let's say, has a 1 in a million chance of winning. You might effectively, for the purposes of assessing this plan for sending your kids to college, you could just assume that this chance of this success is 0, right? The success is going to be so unlikely that let's just forget it. Like, let's consider that a non-workable plan.
Yeah.
And I think that in their heart of hearts, when people, first of all, this kind of thing was not, it was not, cybersecurity at that time was not really even much of something that people thought about in aviation. There had been a case, and I did a podcast about this as well. There was a case in 2011 where the Iranians used GPS spoofing to take control of one of America's most advanced drones. There was some subsequent work that was done by Todd Humphreys at the University of Texas. He was on the podcast talking about how you can do that. Now it happens all the time. Now, if you're a pilot for Finnair, and I've talked to pilots from Finnair, this is something that this makes your life a pain in the ass constantly. They've had to shut down airports because of this kind of thing. But at the time, it was really unknown. So it was very unfamiliar. And I think here's another reason why they set the probability to 0. When they looked at this data that they got from Inmarsat, it looked like it was telling them exactly where this plane went. And they got very excited. And, you know, I don't know if you remember the feeling like you're in the 8th grade math and your teacher gives you this complicated problem with lots of division and multiplication. And then the answer comes out to be like, and it's like, I got to divide 63 by 7. And then it comes out, it's like, it's 9. It's a nice round number. And you're like, oh, that must be it. Because my teacher wouldn't give me an answer that was like 7 and 32/46, right? And so they got this nice, it looked like this plane flew in a nice straight line at a normal airliner speed into this particular patch of the southern Indian Ocean, and it's going to be there. And it made sense. Plus the pilot could set it and da-da. And so what happened to them was that they got an idea that seemed really compelling. And they were like, they believed it. They believed it. Now, belief is a word that should not exist in a scientist's vocabulary. There's only relative probability. It's not very satisfying. People love, because one of the things about getting involved in MH370 is that it's really taught me how contrary to human nature science is. Because human beings have a deep, deep emotional need to believe. They love to have a theory. And so people are constantly coming onto my blog or my podcast and like leaving comments like, I know that this happened. So many people are like, I know what happened to this plane. And sometimes it's something that they had in a dream. Like something came to them, they had a vision. And I don't know how to tell these people, like, look, your vision is not really probative.
I'm sorry. That it was funny. While you were saying, I actually Googled. I was like, I'm making sure, what was out there. But the RQ-170, I mean, the B-2 looking drone that they spoofed.
Yeah.
Again, that's 2011. This is 3 years later.
So they reverse engineered it, made something called the Shahed, and now these things are piling into Ukraine and like blowing things up constantly. So yeah, that really sucked that happened.
Well, but the thing too is they spoofed it, they reverse engineer it, did that. But also, I guess where I could say the probability of this, Russia's flying 777s, right? They have access to 777. So if you had to learn how to manipulate and do, I'm not saying it's Russia, right? But if the 777s proliferate across the world, so if you had to go figure out how to do it, it's not like it's a classified manual. Like,
well, this is a really interesting question actually, because an aircraft like the 777 is packed with proprietary information. The Boeing and Airbus are locked in a very lucrative duopoly / rivalry. It is very hard to understand exactly how a 777 works. And this has important ramifications for cybersecurity, because if you want to understand the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of, say, an iPhone, you can just go buy an iPhone. Or you can probably access documentation online, what have you. 777 has documentation for pilots to operate the aircraft. And I really love that you're a 777 pilot, because I think you can tell me if you think this is true. But I had a guy named Ron Rogers on who was actually who was a test pilot when 777s were entered into commercial service, and the airlines had their own test pilots who flew them and to understand how they worked and everything. And so he was actually there at the dawn, and they had questions for the engineers. It's like, how does this work? And in many cases, the engineers themselves didn't know, and they would have to go find out and maybe ask a vendor. And so the 777, and like, as you say, the Russians, the only way to understand what a 777 is going to do in any given situation is to have a 777, or maybe to be Boeing. And not even Boeing. And so I talked to an excellent aviation cybersecurity expert from Embry-Riddle in a recent episode, and I said to him, like, okay, how could you understand for sure whether a 777 could be hacked in the way that MH370 appears to have been? And he said you would need to assemble Boeing and a roster of vendors to get together and do a penetration test. It would be like a significant undertaking. It could be. It wouldn't be that hard to do if you had people willing to do it. But this knowledge, I guess what I'm saying is, this knowledge is highly siloed. And so when people came out, and in the Netflix documentary, there's a highly respected sort of expert in this particular field of discussion who says this is impossible. You can't control the 777 from the electronics bay. He has no basis for saying that. And yet, in the context of the documentary, when he says that, it has the effect of telling the viewer, okay, Jeff Wise is wrong. What Jeff Wise is proposing is impossible. It's frustrating to me because, and I'm gonna do a very soon upcoming episode about this. It's not true. I mean, it simply is not true that we know a priori that a 777 cannot be controlled from the electronics bay. And so for everyone to get, and you ask, like, how come they called it 0%? That's why they went to 0%, because somehow some people said that it's 0%. And what you have a lot in the whole case of MH370 is people playing outside their realm of expertise. You're a 777 pilot. You don't know how a 777 is wired. You know some about it. You've got the manual, and that tells you a lot. It tells you some of the things that. So in this particular case, to get back to what happened to this plane, everything goes dark, and then an hour later, the SATCOM system gets turned back on. And for years after this case happened, every 777 pilot I talked to, I would say to them, how would you electrically isolate the SDU? And the answer I most commonly got was, what is an SDU? And it's a component of the satellite communication system that we know got depowered. Now, how do you depower it? You probably, I don't know, if you fly 777s like today, right? You're currently a 777 captain?
First officer.
First officer. Okay. So if your captain said, hey, I'm going to go take a leak, while I'm gone, would you please electrically isolate the SDU? Like, what would you do?
That's no idea. Maybe there's a circuit breaker for it, but I can tell you too, in my experience, different methodologies based on countries and operators, et cetera. The philosophy now is dark cockpit. So if any lights are illuminated, like that's something wrong. You do turn off switches occasionally, but it's usually tied to some kind of maintenance function with a part not working. You got to isolate a valve, yada, yada, yada. You can only do that with certain things, right? In my limited experience, just 5 years, one circuit breaker have we pulled and reset over Australia, but it was via SATCOM, talking to tech pilots, maintenance. And
you didn't pull it on by yourself. You asked. Correct. You did it under the advisement of technical experts on the ground.
Correct. Now, if you had a malicious intent, studied it, and you need to do, I guess, something. I guess backing up too. One, yep, I can confirm that the E&E bay, just turn the latch and hop on down there. Could I control the plane down there? Absolutely not. I have no idea. It's like a networking bay, like you've alluded to. Like there's nothing. But if you had a nation state operating behind you that had to plug this USB into here and do X, Y, and Z, that maybe that's a different story. We can dive into that further. But again, I have no idea like how I would isolate the SGU. Maybe it is a circuit breaker and it's right over my head and I can find it and pull it and it shuts it off. I mean, even if you're...
So it turns out that there's two ways to do it. One is to go into the electronics bay, and there are 3 circuit breakers on the far left of the thing that if you know where it is, you can pull them. But it seems like the pilot wouldn't have had time to do that between saying goodnight Malaysia. He only had a minute between saying goodnight and everything going dark, so he couldn't leave the cockpit, go do all this rigmarole, and come back. So the other way to do it is to isolate the entire left AC bus. And this is a pretty dramatic... Now, you said like you would never pull a circuit breaker unless someone on the ground was telling you to do it. Why? Because you don't really know what's going to happen. These electronic systems are interrelated, they're complicated, there's unpredictable causes and effects. You're sort of trained, and this is something that... this is why I love talking to 777 pilots, because there's something about operating a plane for your living that like there's things that culturally you do and things that you culturally don't do, right? And when people started to develop these ideas about what the Inmarsat data meant, they kind of just took it for granted that the captain turned off the SDU and then turned it back on again. And there's 3, and I've tried to push back against, and uninterrogating this assumption. And I've tried to push back against it, saying that, like, I think you really need to interrogate it because it's only because of this reboot that we have all of the data for the last 6 hours. And that it's only because of this data that they had this search area that they were confident was going to work, which, of course, it didn't. There's 3 things that I point out about it. First of all, as we've been discussing, culturally, 777 pilots don't even pull isolated circuit breakers, let alone isolate an entire half of the electrical system of a plane that they don't know what it's going to do. That is just not something a normal 777 pilot would even cross their mind.
100%.
Secondly, there's no motive. Even if we do posit that the captain, Zahari, wanted to commit an elaborate suicide attempt, there's nothing motivating him to do this. Now, one idea that has been popular on the internet is, he wanted to make sure that he wasn't leaving any kind of a trace.